So, our author, Rick Patterson, book, Fever Swamp. Rick is an old-time, long-time vineyard person. Some of you may know him personally. All of you know him as a best-selling novelist. Now, his novels are often political novels, and consistent with having been a lawyer for 17 years before he started being a novelist, these novels go into exquisite and perfect detail on many, many hot-button political issues. He does enormous research on each of these issues, on death penalty, abortion, and many of the other issues he's written about. But these novels are novels. They are fiction. This book, I regret to say, is not fiction. It is the true and sad story of the recent election. I don't know about you, but if you're like me and you still wake up in the middle of the night and you say, how did this happen? This is a book for you. This is a book for you. So the book itself, as many of you may know, is a compilation of Rick's columns in the Huffington Post and Boston Globe, annotated at the end because he can look back and comment on his own columns. And so first question, obviously enough, is when and why did you decide to become a basically full-time political columnist?
Well, it's sort of an urgent moment, I must say. And besides, if I were writing fiction, if I took drugs forever, I couldn't make this stuff up. So you're basically stuck with reality. But I'll tell you a very very short way that this business of writing politically happened. Chris Wallace is a friend. And after a couple of drinks one evening, I said, it'd be fun to be a panelist in your show. Never think I'd be taken up on it. His producer calls me. I'm terrified because I think, wait a minute, the people that do this are people like George Will and Susan Page of USA Today and Robert Costa of the Washington Post. It's not people who make stuff up for a living. So I study and study and study. I anticipate every possible question that Chris could ask me. I walk in the green room, and there's George Will and Susan Page and Robert Costa. I think, boy, I'm really in for it. So I get on, and Chris asked me a question, and I survive. And I asked another question. I didn't think I'd made a complete fool of myself. And afterwards, Susan says to me, you've got another career ready to go. And I thought, really? And I had so much excess information, I was so scared. I went to the airport and wrote a column based on all the stuff I hadn't gotten to say. And the Boston Globe published it, and then a friend of mine said you should get in touch with Arianna Huffington. Next thing I knew, I was on the front page, and it was like crack for an addict. I mean, I love doing it, but also, I mean, the great thing is that you are really paid to learn and paid to think and paid to try to explain to people what's going on. And I've been thinking about this stuff actually for a long time. And the question about what happened that gave us Donald Trump, why it happened and what it means is actually a profound one, which goes way beyond Trump to how we got in this moment, what the effect is on us spiritually and politically, and what's going to happen next. So in the ensuing 2 years in the form of therapy, I've been writing about this every week, first for the Globe, for the Post, now for the Globe and the Post. And it's been fascinating. And one thing that I will say early on about this whole venture of mine is that it was great to have absolutely no ethical constraints at all about saying what I really believe, because I'm not a journalist, okay? Nor am I a psychiatrist, so I'm not constrained by the professional from offering an opinion about somebody I don't know, although we've seen far too much of him. And so I think I was maybe the first person to say, just flat out, what I thought this guy really meant. And it wasn't that he was a brilliant strategist or he had captured populism or any of the other analytic boxes they tried to put Trump in. the traditional ways of explaining them. I said that the only organizing principle that made any sense of this was narcissistic personality disorder. And if you understood what that was, then everything he did made sense, even if it otherwise made no sense at all. And Joe and I were talking about this the other day, so I marked the passage where I sort of tried to address this, and it was very controversial at first and then became less so. I said, but there is nothing more current or important than Donald Trump's psychological fitness to be president. All the hyperventilation of the media, parsing his, quote, positions, pontificating on his strategy or intuition, is a poisonous form of the political correctness he otherwise deplores, rationalizing the abnormal by shoehorning him to the usual analytic boxes. And what it yields is, in great part, rubbish. There is only one organizing principle that makes sense of his wildly oscillating utterances and behavior, the clinical definition of narcissistic personality disorder. The Mayo Clinic describes it as, quote, a mental disorder in which people have an inflated sense of their own importance, a deep need for admiration, and a lack of empathy for others, unquote. This is bad enough in selecting a spouse or a friend, but when applied to a respective president, the symptoms are disqualifying. With Trump ever in mind, try these: an exaggerated sense of self-importance, an unwarranted belief in your own superiority, a preoccupation with fantasies of your own success, power, and brilliance, a craving for constant admiration, a consuming sense of entitlement, an expectation of special favors and unquestioning compliance, a penchant for exploiting or disparaging others, a total inability to recognize the needs of anyone else, an incapacity to see those you meet as individual human beings, an unreasoning fury at people you perceive as thwarting your wishes or desires, a tendency to act on impulse, a superficial charm deployed to disguise a gift for manipulation, a need to always be right, a refusal to acknowledge error, an inability to tolerate criticism or critics, a compulsion to conform your ever-shifting sense of, quote, reality to satisfy your inner requirements, a tendency to lie so frequently and routinely that objective truth loses all meaning, a belief that you're above the rules, an array of inconsistent statements and behaviors driven by your needs in the moment, an inability to assess the consequences of your actions in new and complex situations, in sum, a total incapacity to separate the world from your own psychodrama. And then I say, recognize anyone? That was 14 months ago. And a last bit, what I said at the end, one can forecast the inevitable day-to-day damage to our country, the lashing out, the abuses of power, the mercurial and compass-destroying lies and changes of mind, the havoc his disordered lens would wreak upon our institutions and our spirit. Most dangerous of all is the collision between a volatile world, a leader unable to perceive external reality, and the often unbearable pressures of the presidency. So in the end, I think being a novelist served me pretty well.
So you might think, how could this guy get elected president? And Rick has I'll ask him to just read one other paragraph because he saw this again way ahead of everything. This column is December 3rd, 2015, not 2016. And I'll ask Rick to read it because obviously it has a lot to do, I think, with what later transpired.
Yeah, I began a piece for the Post as follows. The discovery was startling. Since the millennium, middle-class and blue-collar whites are dying at sharply increased rates. The reasons are equally stunning. The primary causes are self-inflicted: drugs, alcohol, suicide. The victims are the least educated. The triggers are poor health and financial distress. Yet the mortality rate for blacks and Latinos is declining. So too for comparable groups in other economically advanced countries. In short, a segment of once secure Americans is suffering an epidemic of shattered dreams. This, it seems, is death by class.
So my question is, and that obviously, again, December 2015, extremely important points and analysis, but why was it that of all the candidates and all the people, Donald Trump was able to be the greatest beneficiary of this, both in the Republican primaries and then later in the election?
Well, the Republican Party set themselves up for this. After 2012, when Romney lost, they went back and did what they called an autopsy on the shortfalls of their performance. And they essentially said, we need to expand our base. We need to reach out to minorities. We need to do a better job of talking to women. We need to specifically to reach out to Latinos. And that was their prescription. And Trump said, no, we're having none of that, basically. And he stepped into a kind of gap because for years the Republican donor classes, the people who want tax cuts and deregulation, had told the base, the middle class base of the Republican Party, that their problem was basically minorities and elites who hated them and people who weren't religion and people want to take away their guns. And that the federal government was a total fraud and their institutions were failing them. The problem is that if you take that message far enough, then you're basically saying don't believe in us either. Don't believe in anything. The only thing that's really going to work is we get somebody in to blow this place up. And so these people who were told that their government was failing them, there was a conspiracy against them, and were suffering economically, and felt marginalized culturally, saw Trump as a sort of human Powerball ticket. You know, that last chance to reverse this situation that they felt, both in terms of their real economic situation in many cases, also just the feeling that they were just being overcome by cultural forces that that didn't care about them and didn't even see them. And so the conceit of the white Republican donor class that they could control this guy was always wrong. You know, the Rubios and the Bushes and those folks were just doomed because there was enough anger out there, and it was really a changed election, that only Trump and, frankly, the odious Ted Cruz had a chance. And by New Year's, I wrote, it's either going to be one of these other guys, forget the rest of them. You could see how all of them, including Kasich, were going to go down in flames, because what Kasich was speaking to was us. You know, the broader sense of people that want to reason politics, where you can disagree about issues without hating each other. And I couldn't see a single primary where the Republican base was going to turn out for him and have him win, except for maybe Ohio.
So you mentioned, and you have some very good columns on Ted Cruz. He, of course, had pinned his hopes on the evangelical vote, but he lost a big chunk of that vote to Trump, whose life, at least maybe to some of us who were naive about things, doesn't seem to be one that would necessarily appeal to evangelicals. But obviously we were wrong. Why did Trump do so well with evangelicals against Cruz, and then, of course, later on?
Well, I think that the social components of evangelical religion are sort of overlooked. I mean, a lot of it's political. For a certain segment of evangelicals, and I say this with a bit of irony, Jesus is a gun-toting tax cutter for whom English is the first and only language. So, very much politics gets merged with religion. The other thing is a sense of social alienation. If you look at why evangelicals, for example, tend to be very sort of anti the whole doctrine of climate change. I mean, you've got a couple things going on. And one of them is that they're at war with science. Because if you believe that the world was made in 7 days, then there are a lot of other things you don't believe in, including Darwin. And so the proponents of climate change, the scientists, those sort of secular-looking people, are already up against it when they come to the evangelicals. And then, frankly, there's a theory that God put us in charge of the earth, and we are supposed to do with it as we will. So I think what we discovered is that evangelical religion, although a moral stance, is less moral than we think. And it has a lot more to do with the social factors and the economic factors that really affect the rest of us.
You want to talk about the role of the media. I two parts. Obviously, the role of the media in the campaign, and then either now or later we could talk about the role of the media since the election. But let's talk about the role of the media in the campaign and how, obviously, it assisted Trump.
Yeah, we talked about this a bit this morning for the folks who were eager to get up at 8:30 and freeze to hear a bunch of us. But one remarkable thing is to realize how much news is driven by revenues, and never more so than in the TV and the cable TV business, where they're very sensitive to that, and they turn over TV hosts, as you know, like crazy. So they look at Trump. He's got a built-in audience from The Apprentice. People watch him for the sheer entertainment value of him. And what CNN, frankly, and others learned, if you just give this guy a microphone and put the camera on him for a half hour and have him say whatever he's going to say, your ratings are going to go through the roof. So basically, I mean, it was actually measured by the Sorensen Center at Harvard. He got something like $3 billion in free advertising before the primary started, just from the cable news and the TV news folks. So I mean, that was a very important factor. I mean, you remember you'd watch Morning Joe or you'd watch Meet the Press, and he could call in his jammies basically and do an interview. Nobody's ever been treated like that except for Trump. So there was an enormous merger between entertainment and entertainment revenues in the Trump campaign. That was, of course, less true for a variety of reasons, or really not true at all of the print media. But the print media had this sort of, I think, false equivalency. We've got to be fair. So, I mean, look, I mean, Hillary Clinton's email thing was a huge mistake, and it cost her. And you know, it was enormous lapse in judgment. One can make of the Clinton Foundation what they will, although they're doing tremendous good work around the world. But I mean, I'm sorry, the Clinton Foundation and the emails are just not the equivalent of the day-to-day outrages of committed by Donald Trump. But the press, you know, I searched articles on emails for something new, and there never was. But they kept spending the same thing. You know, there's a potential for conflict of interest with the Clinton Foundation. Nobody ever found actually what that was. So you had this sort of media-driven dialogue, which said to a lot of people, well, they're both just as bad. And the people on the Democratic left particularly wanted to believe that anyhow. And then there, you know, the Wall Street speeches and the like. So within the print, there was what I would argue an over-concentration on a tired story, which never really moved very much, and that was the email thing. After the election, it's been really interesting because I think everybody in the media, but the press in particular, woke up to their responsibility. And one of the things that's really remarkable is that our president lies to us all the time about all sorts of stuff, some of which is nonsense, the size of his inaugural crowd, for God's sakes. And this is the first time I've seen the press consistently label a lie as a lie, not misspeaking. And so the atmosphere has become much more adversarial, as I think it must be. The problem with that, of course, is he loves that in some ways because he just plays off these folks. And there were really a bunch of brilliant reporters up here with me this morning. And people who are in the opinion business owe them a lot because we really live off their work. But they're not being heard by the Trump base. And, I mean, there are other reasons for that, which we can talk about. But, the press now is talking to us, but really not talking to a lot of Trump's base.
All right, you mentioned the Democratic left, so I want to raise a question which may be a little more controversial than many of the other things we've been talking about. 2 years ago at this book festival, Barney Frank was doing these shows, and he intuited that Bernie Sanders might be appealing to people, let's say, in the Vineyard audience. And he pled with them. He said, do not support Bernie Sanders because if you have a heavily contested primary, that can have a devastating effect on the final election. And he cited the Reagan-Ford primaries and the Kennedy-Carter primaries, and he said, do not support Bernie Sanders. I must say, at that point, I barely knew who Bernie Sanders was. What role do you think, and you did follow that campaign as others, what role do you think the Sanders campaign did have on the ultimate election?
I certainly think it was one of several factors that made a difference, because there was a wide feeling among the Sanders folks who were much more passionate than the Clinton folks. I mean, but passion, you still get only one vote. I mean, Hillary Clinton got 4 million more votes in the primaries than Bernie Sanders did. It's not because, he got screwed. It's not because the primary rules were rigged against him. The primary schedule had been set up long before Sanders ran. And unfortunately for him, there were a lot of early primaries in the South where the component of minority voters among Democrats is very high. He never had, and this is not his fault, he's a senator from Vermont, but he never had a historically strong relationship with minority Democrats. And that really was a place where he lost. So he didn't get screwed, but there was the feeling that he did. And whenever I tried to argue in the pages of the Huffington Post that there was not a conspiracy against Sanders, whatever Debbie Wasserman Schultz might have thought she was doing, I would get notations about my fascist tendencies, my crypto-Republican nature, and a lot of other things. But the problem with that passion is that many people came to think of their vote as a means of self-expression and self-actualization rather than a responsible choice between the only two possibilities, which in the end were Clinton and Trump. So if you look at the 8 million or so voters for third parties, particularly Stein, you can see places where that would have made a real difference. I mean, there are other things. Emails were a problem. The Wall Street speeches were a dumb idea. Getting paid $400,000 by, Goldman Sachs or whoever. Comey, I think, was incredibly influential, and that's another thing I should mention. The email thing is going along, and it's hard to forget this moment, but when Comey came out 10 days before, Hillary Clinton was just coming off the last debate. It was the 3 most dominating debate performances I've seen in a 3-debate format ever. I mean, she just killed him. And she is more vibrant on the trail. She's moving to a positive message, all this stuff. And then the Comey thing, and I talked to people who were in or close to both campaigns, and they said the landscape had really changed. She was back to negative campaigning, the message being, you just can't elect this guy, he's too scary. And Republicans were coming home after the email thing. The media talked about a firestorm, even though it turned out these emails were nothing burgers. And so, I mean, I would say Comey, if you had to name 2 things that weren't her fault, I would say third-party voting and Comey were really, either one of them probably were dispositive.
You mentioned Republicans coming back home. Those of us who are old enough remember, for example, the 1964 election. Barry Goldwater was nominated. He was considered an extremist. Today he'd be a moderate to liberal Republican. But then he was an extremist, and many, many Republicans voted for the Johnson-Humphrey ticket. Why was it that in the end it appears that Republicans, and here I'm not talking about the working class Republicans you talked about earlier, but upper middle class suburban Republicans in, let's say, Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere, in the end returned and voted for Donald Trump?
Well, first of all, we have to identify strongly negative feelings about Hillary Clinton. Regardless of how any of us might feel about her, that she always had high negatives. And so as somebody who was going to be a figure to lure Republicans over, that was always a problem. They had to conclude that he was just nuts, unacceptable. And I know lots of people I know Republicans either did that or very often they sort of threw away their vote on third parties, not biting the bullet. The other thing, aside from polarization, and we can never underrate how polarized we are now, because it's no longer that we're having a debate about principles. The people who disagree with us are the enemy of all we hold dear. That's sort of where we've gotten with this. But the truth is about, prosperous Republicans, their daughters can always get an abortion, but only a Republican can cut their taxes. And I think there's that feeling that the Republicans are sound economically, and very often economically comes down to cutting, my marginal tax rate. So I think all those things meant that Clinton was able to fully capitalize among traditional Republicans as she might have, because of all the negatives and all the polarization.
So here we are, over 6 months afterwards. Trump has exhibited every quality that you wrote about last June.
He doesn't disappoint.
No, he doesn't. And literally, we can take each sentence and put 3 or 4 examples. But now he's put in General Kelly as chief of staff, and I think there's some people saying this will be a sea change. Somehow that Kelly will get control of the White House staff and have some good influence on the president. Do you think Kelly will, in fact, make any significant difference?
Well, first of all, this is a new version of the great conceit, which is all we need is a bunch of gray-haired, square-jawed, white male authority figures around Trump, and they'll shape him up. He'll become docile, he'll learn statecraft, and all this stuff. It was always nonsense. And by the way, speaking of that prototype, isn't Rex Tillerson looking really good right now? Kelly's interesting. He certainly. I'm afraid of him just looking at his picture. He looks like he'd eat you if he weren't happy with you. And I think he will have some effect on the operations of the White House. In his most profound potential effect is that because Trump consumes fake news and idiocy and conspiracies and listens to any fool who has a theory, because he's not really all that busy. He's just sitting around the Oval Office with a short attention span, waiting to be entertained. If Kelly can actually narrow access to him and narrow the flow of nonsense to him, at least he'll have a better basis for making decisions. But the problem is ultimately that he's Trump. And if you assume, as I do, that at 71, his characteristics are irreversible. Kelly is not there to change Trump. And I don't think he'll change him in any profound way. And the question is whether Kelly affects enough order to feel like he's okay, or in 6 months he's out of there. And it'll be interesting to see.
What do we do now? And obviously there are people in this audience who are politically active, people who advise campaigns. Start with one thing. What the Democrats gearing up for the House election are trying to gauge a message. What should our messaging points be? Again, of course, we can repeat over and over again, this guy is crazy, but that didn't work the first time. It may work better now that he's president, but what should Democrats and others who want to change the way the nation is thinking, what should they be saying?
Well, I have a double martini every night, which helps my perspective immensely. But a broader program. I think there's a satire of Democrats, which is very popular among people who aren't, which is that we're precious, cowardly devotees of identity politics. And more concerned with bathroom rights and economics. And, at the risk of being controversial, well, I want to preface this by saying, this party is always, I certainly hope and profoundly believe, going to be in favor of reproductive rights, of gun control, of voting rights, of civil rights, of LGBT rights. and all of those things. But we have to have a broader message than saying we generally care for you and this issue or that issue, even though I've been involved with all of them. And basically that message has to be economic. And it can't be just aimed at white people. Because if you look at our economics, the people who are affected by job displacement, by the loss of the coal mining industry, what have you. In many cases, they're minorities as well as white. And we have to have an economic program. And I think Sanders had a point, which is we need to be concerned with the people who are losing their jobs. And they're losing their jobs, by the way, not mainly to globalization, but to automation. We need to be concerned that our kids can't afford to go to college. We need to be concerned with crushing student debt. We need to be concerned with fortifying Social Security and keeping it safe. And we need to do those things because the more opportunity there is in this country, the richer we all are. We all are better off if we're drawing on the talent pool of more and more people. That simply makes sense. I mean, that's why we got to be a great country in the first place, because people came here looking for opportunity. They found it, and they found it broadly. Our public schools were strong. Our highways connected us. We had a rising sense of prosperity and hope. And until the Democrats can speak to that broadly, they're in trouble. The other thing is, if you look at the map, it's pretty interesting. I think 19 Democratic governors. We lost one just yesterday, and 31 in 31 Republicans. 16% of American counties voted for Hillary Clinton. 84% voted for Donald Trump. The preponderance of not only governorships but state legislatures are controlled by Republicans, which means they gerrymander districts so that people in those districts are more worried about being primary by some real nut from the right, than they are about a threat from the left. And until the Democrats find a way to make themselves a national party and really have a broader economic message, but also dare to go into states and work hard at the local level where things are sort of discouraging, not going to get anywhere. And sometimes that means not running a generic Democrat who can pass every possible litmus test except winning an election, because that's just dumb. I mean, I admire Elizabeth Warren, but she couldn't win a Senate race in Montana, okay? Just couldn't do it. So we have to be aware of that kind of thing. And we have to be able to say to people, we're really not your class enemy. Because right now, if people think about Martha's Vineyard at all, they're thinking about a bunch of people who go to cocktail parties and are doing pretty well and don't care about them. Now, I don't go to cocktail parties. I don't know anybody's doing very well, so I don't know what they're talking about. But seriously, the whole feeling that we are an elite, coastal elite, has really taken hold, and that's something we need to fight.
I'm going to open it up for questions. I just want to say one thing. When Sue Ellen asked me whether I would do this, I have to say my initial thought was, will this just be too painful? And yes, there is some pain in reading this book, but I don't think, and this is an incredibly valuable book for all of us who want to truly understand what did happen, and for all of us who are seeking in all different ways of how we move forward. So I do hope you'll all read it, and please bring up your questions.
Yeah, me too. My kids want you to read it.
Hi. You mentioned reproductive rights. What do you think about the DNC coming out recently and saying that it's not a litmus test that they'll consider candidates that aren't pro-choice?
I think, well, let me give you an example. There was a mayor of Omaha, mayoral candidate in Omaha, who had cast some votes which were on the pro-life side, although the question whether he was ultimately pro-life on the basic issue was up for grabs. And there was a terrible fight within the Democratic Party about whether that guy should even be allowed to run, whether Democrats could endorse him. Look, I've got to say that and I've written about this, that I'm profoundly in favor of reproductive rights and abortion rights. I do not think it is terribly important to the future of the Democratic Party that a mayoral candidate in Omaha embrace the reproductive rights program right down the line. I just don't, because there are other things that we really need to worry about. And look, I mean, I have a friend who is very involved in the gun movement, and my friend told me, I can't support so-and-so, the senator from Arkansas, because he's bad on our issues. Okay, so we lost. And now we have a guy down there, Tom Cotton, who's bad on every issue you can think of. And so these are tough choices. But I think the Democrats, depending on their local environment, have to make them. I think it's possible to be a strongly pro-choice party without, assuming that everybody signs off on every I and T on an agenda.
I'll just kibitz. We need to get control of the House. If we have control of the House, no negative legislation with respect to abortion will pass.
That's right.
If some of the members of that House are themselves anti-choice, as long as we have control of the House and they're willing to go along with the party, which I think they will in most cases, and we may pick up a handful of Republicans, you're always going to be better off on that issue, and indeed on virtually every other issue, with having a Democratic House. If
Yeah,
you
I
do
wanna
not have
say-
a Democratic House, it's going to be disastrous.
And this man knows, he worked closely with Nancy Pelosi for years. And it makes a great difference if Chuck Schumer is majority leader and Nancy Pelosi is Speaker of the House in terms of what legislation moves, what the agenda is, and all of that. So I second what Joe says.
So Trump's most recent poll, according to Quinnipiac, shows 33% support.
Where are we?
I'm over here.
Okay. Hey, how are you?
How are you?
I lost you for a minute.
So Trump's most recent Quinnipiac poll shows that 33% of Americans think he's doing a good job. So how optimistic are you about 2020?
Well, here's the problem. It's the map. It was what I was talking about before. The feeling of Democrats has always been that if we turn out more of the rising demographic, young people, minorities, single women, etc., that we're going to win. And the problem is the electoral map and how voters are distributed, because we're basically wasting votes because most of those folks live in those 16% of counties I was talking about. So that 33%, and I think they can't be reduced too much more than that because they're just not listening to folks like me, certainly, have a power to drive the agenda in the Senate, and particularly in the House, where they're so worried about being primaried. So if you look at the caution that the Republicans feel and their willingness to sort of kind of go along with Trump, it's not that they think he's a great man. It's that they're worried about the folks back home. They're worried about those 33%. So they have more power than their numbers. That said, if we can craft a broader message, we're going to peel some people away. This guy is clearly a train wreck, and he's going to be a train wreck. And, not everybody who's voted for him is so insensate as to not to know. The thing that we can't do, and it's real a problem, is imply by our message, by the Democrats' message, that they're fools. Because the social divide is bad enough already.
Okay, right here.
Thank you. This is your comments are very interesting, and I've read some, but you don't deal with the issue, if it has any impact at all, of race in this last election and of race going forward. And it seems to be, again, a big elephant in the room that we aren't having a way to deal with. And I'll be the first to admit that African Americans helped us, Democrats, lose this election. So what are we going to do about race as an issue here?
Well, I'm sorry I didn't read my chapter on that, because it's you're raising a very serious concern. And let me double back a little bit, because this is also about the Supreme Court. For years, the Republican Party has attacked voting rights acts voting rights, and they've attacked it ever since there was a mass migration in the South from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, because it was totally about civil rights. It wasn't that they suddenly discovered the joys of limited government and how smart Republicans were. It was all about race. And people forget that Ronald Reagan, in his first campaign appearance, went to Philadelphia, Mississippi, where 16 years before, 3 civil rights workers had been killed. So they've been playing this game for years. And this nonsense about massive voter fraud, which Trump, by the way, implied was committed by people who lived in inner cities, you know who, is just a complete fraud, and it's racism, but it's serious because they really do repress voting by minorities and by poor people, regardless of race. The second thing is affirmative action. And, you know, there are lots of people that think John Roberts is just the very personification of a Chief Justice. I wrote that John Roberts is the kind of guy you see in a country club drinking a scotch, which his black waiter has just bought to him, thinking that, you know, the only problem with race is there's too much catering to minorities. I mean, it's just phenomenal, and he writes opinions that read like that. I mean, he asked in one opinion, why a minority presence in a physics class would change the content of a physics class. Hell, it changes the content of the entire university. It changes the experience that people have with each other. It changes how they see America. So, yes, I think this stuff is very important, and I certainly, when I talk about having a broader agenda, that does not preclude at all our absolute obligation to fight for civil rights and voting rights and for equal access to the instrumentalities of education and employment. I mean, that's part of what our DNA is and should be as Democrats. So I hope nothing that I say suggests that this book is, lies outside that concern, or that my talking about the Democrats' message precludes that. A final word: we've got this fraudulent voting fraud commission, chaired by that brilliant man Mike Pence, but really run by the Secretary of State of Kansas, a guy named Chris Kobach, who's made sort of racial gerrymandering and racial exclusion his reason for being as a politician. So this is an ongoing thing. And by the way, it is a sort of a sign of Trump's pathology that he can make up a false narrative about voter fraud, because it's statistically non-existent, and conjure into existence a commission to investigate which doesn't exist. And so that's the environment we're living in.
My question is two. One, who should the Democrats have put up that might have won over Trump? Second of all, what does it say about the American people that we are allowing this liar to continue on, where we just seem not to get very much involved? And third of all, should not the press be more concerned, or as concerned, about what's happening now with, in terms of what the various people that have control over energy and over justice are doing? Because one of the things that I think is probably happening is we're paying a lot of attention to Trump as a distraction for the kinds of things that are happening now on all the levels, whether it's housing, energy, justice.
Well, first of all, you've done something terrible, cruel to me. I just turned 70, and you've asked me to remember 3 questions. That's not so easy. So you may have to come back and prompt me. But starting with who should the Democrats have run, I don't think Bernie would have won. Just my opinion. Hillary didn't win. Joe Biden conceivably could have, because of the working class appeal and the lack of some of the negatives. But at this point, we can go looking for a Joe Biden type. But it shouldn't be Joe Biden. At 70, I don't want an 80-year-old president. I don't think that's really what we need to be doing as a party. I think we need to, I don't mean we conjure somebody from the ether who has no experience, but I think we have lots of potential people. There seem to be like about 5 from Massachusetts, but also from places like Montana and elsewhere. I just think we find somebody who has enough experience getting elected with the kind of message that we've been talking that would be helpful. In terms of why hasn't Trump gone yet, well, the answer is he doesn't want to. And Melania is happy he's being kept busy. But there's a lot of talk about impeachment and a lot of talk about the 25th Amendment, but the truth is that both of them require a majority in Congress, and that's not going to happen, if it ever does, until after 2018. I think the third question you asked me, and maybe I'm making this up, was about policy. And part of the problem is that Trump's behavior is really outstripping the consideration of serious policy issues, whether it's infrastructure, which seems to have gotten lost somewhere, or the environment, or voting rights, or any number of things that we should be looking at. For example, how we deal with folks who are really economically jeopardized by the faces of automation and job displacement. I mean, we got to tell them the truth. I mean, we can't bring those jobs back. Coal is not coming back, and globalization can't be repealed, but we need to seriously give them access to education, retraining, anything that we can do and do for their kids, who they care about deeply, to make their lives better. There's a lot of good work being done in the Washington Post, New York Times, by the people who really do follow these policy issues. The problem is they're not top of the fold because every day he tweets something else. But in terms of what we can do, and I should double back to that, whatever, give money, volunteer, care. And remember that the goal is to win in favor of a broad set of principles which make America a more inclusive place, and not your purest notion of what the Democrats should be, because that was one of the things that helped us lose.
Thank you all. Thank you, Rick.